talk about real-world data in particular and what actuaries do, and then we're going to go through briefly a couple of segments about how to use real-world data to support market sizing, pricing, segmentation, and benchmarking to understand your patients that you'll be working towards. This is really geared towards reimbursement strategies and outcomes research types of things using real-world data. It applies very well to small companies and startups. You'll want to have access to this kind of data as you think through how you're going to market your product. For larger companies, it's also applicable, but it tends to get more into areas of high-priced products that you might want to take risk for, or that might be part of a bundle payment type of value-based pricing strategy that you might want to do. So that's where most of this will be applicable. The first step is we work for a company called Milliman. It's a actuarial company. We're one of the largest actuarial consulting firms in the world, and we work with many device manufacturers and pharmaceutical companies. We also work with most of the insurance companies and many providers, hospitals, provider groups throughout the country and throughout the world. And we are worldwide. We have offices in the Middle East and the East and Europe and in various other places, as you can see from the map. So many of you, as I've talked to you, ask, what is an actuary? What do we do? Actuaries are experts in managing risk and uncertainty. There's strict professional and ethical standards that are applied by actuaries, similar to accountants. Accountants tend to look backward. We tend to look forward. We're financially oriented, outcomes oriented, and we're future oriented, as I mentioned, instead of backward oriented. So we do a lot of projection type of things using math. So we also do a lot of risk adjustment, predictive modeling, return on investment studies, et cetera. And this is very applicable to how the insurance companies will view your product. And since we understand the insurance market extremely well, we find that we can add a lot of value to how you think about your reimbursement strategies. We have available to us about 100 million people's worth of claims to use to support our work. And this has become particularly useful in the real-world data environment. We have a membership base, so all the members for a population, so we can do population-based studies, claims and risk levels for those. And then from that, we can do benchmarking. It's very detailed data. We have every claim for all 50 million people or 100 million people. We have it segmented into several different market segments as well. We have our own data sets, about 50 million people. We have the market scan data, which you may be familiar with. It's now IBM. It used to be called Truven. There's many different names, but the market scan data is available to us. We have the CMS 5 and 100% limited data sets. We have a Part D database for claims data, and we have a number of state discharge data sets as well. So combined all together, we have a lot of data to work with, terabytes and terabytes. So how do we use this? Very quickly, the alphabet soup of coding. Some of this was alluded to. Stephen did a good job for reimbursement. The CPT and HCPCS codes and DRGs are particularly useful. We also have probably 50 different diagnostic related categories, so 25 or 30 diagnosis codes, and then diagnosis procedure codes for inpatient stays. The interesting thing about Milliman data is that we build it so that it's uniform. So for benchmarking purposes, every data set, it looks the same to us after we process it and add a whole bunch of fields to it. So the nice part about it is that if you got a data set in from another carrier and you wanted to use that to do additional analysis, we can process it and put it into the same format so that the counting rules are very similar. One of the tricky parts of real world data is counting things. A good example is people that go through the emergency room for a simple one may end up as an inpatient stay. If they end up in an inpatient, then you count that in the inpatient stay as a piece of the services that were provided. If they get discharged from the emergency room, then you count that separately as an emergency room visit. And when you do population-based statistics, you want to know the difference of when they were there or when they were not there. Similarly, with skilled nursing facilities or other physician services that might be accompanied with the inpatient stay. So counting things becomes very tricky sometimes, and not everybody does it well. That is the primary value of what we do with our processing of data and making it standard, is to get it so that we can count things. So that's a lot of real world data. How do we use it? Or when do you use it? When do you actually maybe pick up the phone and call somebody that has data like this to work with? And why would you do it? So let's suppose that you want to introduce a new product to the market. So it's a crowded market. Maybe you want to understand how your product would fit in. We can look and see what the products are that are out there, what they're being priced at the various price points for Medicaid, for Medicare, for commercial. We can see the range of prices that might be getting charged and accepted for allowed amounts and charged amounts. And then we can see how you might fit in, and then what the market share might be in those particular products. Or let's suppose that you have a product and you're marketing it, it's been approved, but you want to move into a different venue and you want to increase your market share. So maybe you need to understand who the players are, what's going on inside the market, and how you would extend it out. Maybe you're going to branch into a different setting, for example, moving from inpatient to outpatient surgery types of things, and see what that market might look like. Another way is you might want to be shifting to a new market entirely, and so you might want to understand that market better. In terms of the starting points on a timeline, it's not a bad idea to start with looking at claims data before you construct your preclinical research. And the reason I say that is because we had a client who will tell you that it was very valuable to understand how things like what his product would do were currently being thought about in the Medicare marketplace and in the commercial marketplace. And that led them to realize that they needed to select a different code, or the way that they would go about trying to pursue a code for reimbursement. It's also useful if you have it, although sometimes it's tricky because clinical trials are expensive and the endpoints are guarded carefully in terms of what you want to achieve for FDA approval. But when you get to the pricing piece of it, Stephen Hull was very good about kind of trying to allude to this. When you get to the pricing component of it, it would be very nice to be able to link your clinical trial outcome metrics to some of the real world data so that you can connect where the price differences are going to occur. So it's just a consideration. It does add a little bit of expense sometimes, but it can inform you about how to construct your trials. And I think that's an important consideration as well. Some people wait until they get to their market trials where they're starting to set up their codes and get CMS, and that's in preparation for billing and market launch. That's an important component of it as well, and that's a great place to engage us. And we do a profile of the expected patients and what the billing looks like. And then you're at full market launch. Sometimes you're a little bit behind the curve, and maybe you run into some challenges, and going back and looking at some of the data sometimes is helpful when you see that as well. So those are their starting points. So my suggestion is that before you study your target customers, get to know them really, really, really well. And people are always surprised at what they learn when they do a deep dive profile into the data and see things that they hadn't thought about. We haven't had a client yet that hasn't looked at the data and go, oh, I hadn't thought about that piece of it. That's important, and it helps set their strategy as they get ready to go to market. So let's talk about what that might look like a little bit. I've got about 10 minutes or so. Let me just quickly work through these 5 considerations. We'll go by one. So market size. If you're a device manufacturing, you're thinking of an opportunity model. How many of these can I sell? We had a client several years ago, a wound care company, who said, we have 1 million wounds that we can apply this device to. And that was their mantra, 1 million devices sold every year. And the problem is that when we look at it by payer type, commercial, Medicaid, Medicare, TRICARE, we learned that some of those, particularly in the Medicaid, were pressure ulcer patients, and they were in end-of-life situations, and the product really didn't apply. And so there was maybe 25% of their market, when they started to look at it more carefully, that they kind of had to put aside because it wasn't really applicable. So the payers are going to look at it a little bit differently, and depending on the payer type, you may have a very different strategy about how you might want to market to them. Defining the population is probably the trickiest part. This is a seizure definition for illustrative purposes. And we segmented the seizure categories into these grand mal, motor, post-traumatic, non-motor, other convulsions, febrile, and PNES. That's a psychiatric, not non-epileptic seizures. So they're not really brain activity. That's more psychiatric in nature. So as you segment these, then you need to find the ICD-10 codes that are applicable, or combinations of ICD-10 codes and procedure codes, or combinations of those plus place of service in order to get to a clear definition. Sometimes there are standard definitions for diabetes and heart failure, very common, but for particular types of things that you might be applying your product to, this can be an exercise all in itself, is to define it. Once you have this defined for the payers, they're very helpful for them to understand how you are defining that patient, because when you get to the billing component to it, it will help them define the patient for billing purposes and how to appropriately tag and reimburse you for those services. So this definition process becomes a key communication tool for the payers in the reimbursement process. That's why it's an important piece of it. So pricing, device manufacturers typically think of it as, what can I charge for it? For payers, though, again, how is it going to be paid? What definitions are you using? What are the technology reviews that need to be done? Requirements for reimbursement? What documentation is required, et cetera? It's going to be different for each payer type. It's going to be different for Medicare, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an important piece of it, and you're going to maybe look at it a little bit differently from the payer's perspective. Some of the gatekeepers that you have to get through are maybe group purchasing organizations, technology committees, cost-effectiveness studies may be required. Stephen said there are 5 studies required for most reimbursement level things to happen. That's probably right. It felt very, very right to me. So getting those set up with an eye towards the reimbursement piece of it will be important. Market segmentation. You saw that segmentation for seizure types. Device manufacturers are particularly going to be interested from the clinical perspective based on specialty, maybe place of service, and looking where their greatest value proposition might be happening. From a payer perspective, you're also going to be looking at severity and disease type, place of service, and also the specialty. So there's a fair amount of overlapping. There is a tendency to not account for in your segmentation relative risk of the patient. The the quote here is where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average. So not everybody is above average, because that's not the definition of average. And so there is a segmentation and demographic and health status that is an important consideration when you think about the market segmentation that needs to be done. An example of this is emergency room department visits have a distribution for different populations. And some people are going to have more visits than others. So you need to kind of be able to, diabetic populations are going to have much different segmentations than others, depending on the risk of the patient that you're looking at. So you need to understand the relative risk of the population that you're looking at. And then benchmarks and utilization. From a device manufacturer, you're typically going to look at what percentage of the physician's practice might be used, and clinical standards. From a payer perspective, population-based is what you're going to want to look at. And then disruption. What's the potential for your device to disrupt the market a little bit? And we want to get into episodes of care kind of thing, and what gets added on for cost and utilization, what gets taken away. And that's where your ROI studies come into play, is in the market disruption. And we can do that with the claims data to look and see what the typical patient profile looks like, what gets added, what gets taken away, what the value proposition then becomes for the patient. So 4 minutes, I think we're about done here. When to start? Come to us if you're trying to get into a current market, expand your markets, or enter into a new market. It's better to come early. If you get behind the scenes, we can still help. Or behind the 8 ball a little bit, we can still help. But it's more playing defense than it is playing offense the later you start. So that's just a consideration to think about. And that's my famous caveat page. You can read it and enjoy. But that's the essence of what it is that we do, and things that are considerations as you start to march using real world data, real world evidence. This is a great source of data, your large claims data sets, and I would encourage you to consider it. Thank you for your time, and hopefully we'll see you in our booth or in other places. I'll turn the time back over to the moderators, who I can't hear.
Thank you, Dave. Sorry you can't hear us. That's a great presentation.
Absolutely, yeah. And if anyone's interested in connecting with Dave and his team, Ellen and Donna, you can schedule a meeting with them using our meeting scheduler platform to learn more about their actuarial and consulting services. And we will be going on a quick break now, our virtual networking break. But prior to that, we'll do our first raffle draw for the $200 Amazon gift cards. So here from my staff, I got the names of the people who so far have visited the booths. And I will just randomly select one individual. And I'll select this ticket over here. We have Mr. Samuel Can from Medtronics. Mr. Samuel, if you're in this room, we'll also reach out to you for your $200 Amazon gift card that you can redeem. And Prime Day is coming up as well in July, so you can utilize it there. So again, feel free to visit the booths during the networking session. In the next half hour, we'll regroup at 11:05 for Dr. Marcy Glicksman's talk. And until then, I hope everyone has a nice break. Thank you.